Difficulty settings in modern narrative-focused games often use a standardized language to communicate challenge. If you want the game to be moderately difficult, it's called normal. If you want it to be particularly difficult, it's called hard, or maybe it'll be some other edgy in-joke word to signify that you're taking on a serious challenge. If you want something easy though, it's not simply always called easy. Instead, it's often going to be called something like story mode. This trend has occurred because in order to experience the narrative of a game, you need to satisfy the win state criteria in order to progress and get to the next cutscene. In these games which offer a story mode, the narrative and the mechanical gameplay live in two separate dimensions, unaffected by each other. So if you want to play the game just for the story, all you have to do is make the gameplay easier, which lowers the barrier for experiencing the narrative. Developers communicate with the people who aren't as interested in engaging with the game's systems, instead wanting to focus on experiencing the story, by offering the easy option as the story mode. But what if there was a way to completely decouple progression from demanding mechanical input, and instead, progression gaining lived in the narrative dimension? Such a concept challenges what most people would define as a video game, and that's precisely what Return of the Obra Dinn accomplishes. At its core, it is a detective mystery game, but it services this format in a way almost no other game has ever done before or since, by completely untethering game progression from any higher-level mechanical input, opting for it to instead occur entirely within the mind. And by God, has this game perfected its execution of a really rare concept. Like, really, really rare. The game's triumph lies in its ability to craft a compelling narrative experience, despite having seemingly little in the way of narrative complexity to offer. Though devoid of any detailed exposition, the structure and presentation of the narrative turns what would otherwise be a generic story into something genuinely interesting. The game left me in such a sense of awe of having pulled off the premise of progression in the mind, which is mystifyingly almost totally absent from the industry. And it's not just me. Just about everyone who has played this game comes away with a memorable experience. It's impossible for me to resist the urge to dissect and explore what makes this game so widely adored. The quality that the game offers is only more impressive when you look at the solo developer behind it. Lucas Pope started his career working under various studios in larger teams, but really came to fame with his solo-developed cult classic entry, Papers, Please. A document-checking game with slice-of-life energy, political intrigue, and philosophical moral commentary. On its release, the game was praised for its tight, focused design and thought-provoking premise. Well, he went and did the impossible, making a more than worthy game in the wake of Papers, Please, solidifying himself as one of the biggest, I think the technical term is giga-chads, in the solo dev space, putting him on my list of people I'm insanely jealous of. When you watch the credits to Return of the Obra Dinn, it comes up with Lucas Pope's name, and then it's a slow roll across all of the people who helped with localization, then the voice actors, and that's it. While these more or less external people absolutely have an important role in the final product releasing as it did, in terms of the creative vision and how it was executed, it is 100% Lucas Pope. The only direct external input has gone into either character performance or the distribution of the game. It is not often a single creator can pull off a game with this level of polish and production, and so consistently as well. It's seriously impressive, and he now has a consistent reputation for executing novel ideas in the gaming landscape. To understand how this is done in Return of the Obra Dinn, we need to look at how the game works. Mechanically, the game is dead simple. You can walk around and you have a single interaction button. It's a standard first-person affair. Now I'm being a little unfair ignoring the book the game gives you, but I'll get to that later. For now, the point is, the information gathering part of the game is notably simple. The key here, which makes the interaction so engaging, is the magic pocket watch bestowed upon you, allowing you to interact with dead bodies. And oh ho ho, lucky us, we got ourselves a ship full of them. When you use this pocket watch on a dead body, it looks like this.
You bastards may take exactly what I
The striking audio-visual embellishments make every single death scene in the game grandiose and dramatic in a way which gives significant presence to every event experienced in the game. The way the screen slowly shrinks to a dark monotone shade, a prelude is given for the events in the coming scene before a dramatic reveal of the visual freeze frame, accompanied by a score which feels like it enhances the events way more than it deserves to. Seriously, I don't know how Pope does it. You then have to deduce, by clicking some boxes, what each person's name was, what their fate was, which is usually death, and who was responsible for their fate. Sounds simple, but the game makes a lot of this very obscure for most of the fates. You therefore have to figure them out through deduction only. You are the one who must investigate the scene. You are the one who interprets the evidence. You are the one who must recontextualize new evidence. No one is there to do this for you. More importantly, to progress, you must fill in the fates yourself. All of these processes, apart from the physical clicking of boxes, occur in the mind. It's a logic puzzle at its core, but one which mimics the process of role-playing a detective. While exposition is, in the first instance, delivered via dialogue before the death events, as well as the visual content of the events themselves, the exposition is not fully understood until the fates in the game are correctly solved. The murder of the violinist is just a trivial moment gone by, until you realize the culprit is Edward Nichols, the ship's second mate, exposing a story arc of betrayal. The exposition is therefore largely delivered via successfully solving logic puzzles. Understanding the mystery of the Obra Dinn is what progresses the narrative, and thus the game. The guess 3 to reveal whether you're correct system mostly prevents cheese as well, leaving just about everything up to deduction. So, this is fundamentally how the premise of the game is executed. It's simple on the surface, but it's not enough to just lay out clues and hope that the player will enjoy their time and get something out of the process. In a vacuum, the premise is not enough. There's a lot of deliberate choices in the background harmonizing together to make it all work. One of the biggest of these elements is the book. If you had to meticulously keep notes on every single scene and passenger in the game using pencil and paper, you'd spend more of your time outside of the game than in it. So instead, you can access a book where the game keeps tabs on what you've witnessed so far. And this is also where you can input your deductions. Although I should say it's almost guaranteed you'll need at least some external note-taking to track the smaller details in the game. I certainly did. Quite a bit, actually. The book, however, is fascinating in that it single-handedly achieves the Herculean feat of getting the massive complex web of information to appear as simple as it does. From the passengers' names and details, to each death on board, the locations of each death, their chronology in the narrative, and of course, the checklist of fates for the player to verify their deductions. As powerful as the book is to making the game experience smooth and the high-level premise work, it also brings with it the two problems generally brought up with the game experience. One is the deduction difficulty rating. In principle, the number of triangles above a character represents how difficult solving their fate is at a given point in the game. But the number of triangles feels like it only occasionally relates to the true difficulty of deduction. 3 triangles is sometimes oddly easy to solve, and single triangles can be secretly difficult, making you feel like you missed something, but by the time you solve it, you end up instead feeling like the balance of difficulty indication is off. It's a simple issue in principle, but ends up inducing scenarios where you think you're missing something super obvious as you peruse an easy deduction, when there was more complexity than implied by the game. The other problem is the tedium which sets in once you've experienced all of the scenes for the first time, since you have to revisit most of them, often several times, to absorb all of the clues necessary for proper deduction. This means physically walking around the ship, clicking through many layers of death, just to find out what kind of shoe someone was wearing. This is one of those moments in creative design where a compromise has to be made, and it's subjective. Give a more streamlined experience to the player, or deliver on the consistency of the procedures in place. Pope responded to this very criticism in a Rock Paper Shotgun interview with Alex Wiltshire, where he says, quote, "That's one of the risks, gambles, I took, that I take in a lot of my games, where I inconvenience the player in order to hold the mood, the sense of rules I've set up." End quote. This is a bit of a side note, but it's emblematic of the trade-off present in any kind of design. If there were a perfect game, it would be closer to existing year on year through the obsessive optimization of progress at scale. But clearly, either of two choices here present pros and cons, and as I'll discuss later, maintaining a sense of immersion is an essential element of this game. So perhaps forgoing instant event visitation was the right call. Really, there is no right answer here. Everyone will have their own preference, but what made it into the game was a part of a creative vision as much as anything else was. So it's true that a key part of the game is how narrative is tied to exploration, but in addition to this, the narrative experience is completely non-linear. The non-linear concept is a core pillar in Return of the Obra Dinn. I'll get back to why, but at the surface, it's not overly interesting. This is pretty much the standard format for how the minor narratives of most detective stories are structured, that is, the stories of the mysteries themselves. Think about your classic Sherlock Holmes mystery, or even a standard LA Noire crime, if you let me be a bit reductive for a moment. The core structure is piecing together an event after it has occurred, usually a crime, like a murder. It begins with an introduction to the conclusion of the event, say, a dead body. Then clues must be gathered, suspects must be investigated, perhaps a minor late narrative twist recontextualizes the story thus far, and finally the gruff detective protagonist recounts the story in chronological order, and everything finally clicks into place in a single moment. Essentially, the structure is a story told in reverse chronological order. This is what allows the mystery to remain tense and exciting the whole way through. For many, the satisfaction of a good mystery is in trying to solve the mystery alongside the detective protagonist, and the catharsis of the final reveal, especially if you've been particularly observant and picked up the clues earlier than the overarching story delivers them. A weakness with this mode of mystery structure in a standard story is that the audience doesn't always share the aha moment of the protagonist. Sometimes this is by design, to subvert expectations, but in the cases where it's not, it can lead to a disappointing mystery. In the medium of video games, this can become a particular issue where audience disconnect has more serious consequences. I mentioned LA Noire before, and I think this makes a nice contrast. LA Noire bridges the gap somewhat, as the win state of the game largely revolves around correctly solving cases. So you're incentivized to go beyond just passively consuming the mystery, and instead you're being asked to actually solve the mystery. Ultimately though, these stories can just be played without any conviction if the player's getting bored or confused, and the detective roleplay element is lost. Return of the Obra Dinn is almost a direct solution to this problem, and works as a much better detective game for the purpose of conveying a real sense of mystery solving at least, than something like LA Noire or a Sherlock Holmes game. I need to quickly pause here to say, I actually love LA Noire. I would never say it's a bad game, so please forgive me for my transgressions, Team Bondi. I miss you. Alright, let's get back to Return of the Obra Dinn. This game has almost the same structure in its overall narrative as the 5 elements of a mystery story I mentioned earlier. But in this case, it's applied to the overall story, not just the sub-narratives. Think about it. Where do you begin the game? The end. Literally. This is what gives the detective mystery feel. This non-linearity is felt throughout every fibre of the game, and it's not just a reverse recount of a mystery story, but instead the game mechanics for exploration itself have you travelling through time non-chronologically. So you're there piecing together the mystery, travelling from the conclusion to the beginning through time itself, like a true detective, but in a meta way. This is combined with the physical progression the player makes through the game. You have to go deeper into the ship, downwards, in order to progress through the mystery. So you travel from recent events to events further in the past, as you simultaneously travel deeper into the ship, the whole while travelling deeper into the mystery itself. It's an excellent way to sell the feeling of solving a mystery with pacing alone. And about that pacing, you can imagine that the bulk of the story could be told up front in a linear way, with all the details, in probably about 10 minutes. But you solve the mystery of everyone's death one by one, and a drip-fed exposition for the story of the Obra Dinn over about 10 hours instead. The writing, while tight, with believable characters, is extremely simple. In summary, a ship with a full crew is delivering for the East India Company. It turns out that a group of Formosans were transporting a supernatural seashell, where, by the way, I feel like I have to give a little bit of trivia here. Formosa is an old republic which existed very briefly during the game's historic setting, where current-day Taiwan is. This is an insanely niche and accurate addition to the game. I feel like I just have to add that. Anyway, one of the captain's mates tries to steal the magic seashell by framing a Formosan for murder, which incites various sea monster attacks of the Obra Dinn. Most of everyone gradually dies. The sea monsters eventually stop attacking when the captain bargains with one of them, and then the remaining survivors of the ship turn on each other for fear of mutiny. At the end of it all, the captain of the ship kills his fellow shipmen in self-defense, and finally himself in the wake of the loss and destruction. While there's not really much in the way of character development, not really that much meat to make a layered story, that's not the point. It's the structure and pacing of the story which makes an incredibly strong narrative experience, elevating that story in a very untraditional way. Despite the simplicity, you feel like you know all 60 people who served on board the ship with some level of intimacy by the time you're done. This is due to the slow burn delivery and insane attention to the smallest of character and world details, bringing a heavy investment in the narrative for anyone engaged with it. The story is fascinating not necessarily because of its content or depth, but in the way it's delivered. This is truly an impressive outcome for the game. Ultimately, the reverse order solutions give the sense of constant discovery. Exposition is rarely direct and is instead embedded in the discovery process itself. So, what is actually going on to make the process of playing feel like real mystery solving beyond just the narrative structure? The answer is how progression is gated for both the win state and the narrative. Let's take a look at Noire again, which is less logic and more about trying to quantify how scrunched up someone's face is. Noire is also more mechanically demanding, with combat, gunplay, and driving as well, decoupling progression even further from pure deduction. Additionally, a list of reasonable solutions is offered up front, and the choice becomes the one which appears the most reasonable. In Return of the Obra Dinn, very little stimulus is offered. So much of the game takes place in the mind, not on the screen. But then, to progress to the win state, to actually solve the fates the game gives you, you must synthesize new knowledge and understanding to connect disparate strands of information the game presents. No partial solutions are given to you. No one else is helping you connect the dots. There is one exception here though, which is if you cheese the game a bit. This can be done occasionally by being sure about two fates and cycling through options in a third fate. Outside of this though, you're entirely on your own. I think the common criticisms towards the chapter you reveal last, called the bargain, exemplify by contrast the elements which allow this game to work as well as it does. When I completed this chapter, I felt underwhelmed, but at the time I didn't really understand why. On paper, it should be satisfying. There's no Deus Ex Machina type twist. The use of an animal's death via the pocketwatch is established early on, so this is not a cop-out. It also ties to the revelation that one of the passengers is the very person who gave you the job, which many people may not have realized early on. Also, the captain's revealed to have genuinely tried to help the ship and its crew by bargaining with the mermaid sea monsters. A minor twist as the captain's presented to have only acted in self-interest up until that point. And you finally figure out why the Obra Dinn returned in the first place, with the seashell you see out in the ocean the whole game having been given to one of the mermaids tasked with guiding the ship back home. This revelation should be satisfying. The game is called Return of the Obra Dinn after all. So why doesn't it give that satisfaction? Well, the structure of this chapter breaks the rules set up in the rest of the game. Yes, we experience the scene backwards as always, but the biggest revelations are front-loaded in the first couple scenes of the chapter. The lingering nature of each scene as you wait for the music to play out doesn't work here, since there are very few details to interpret, and you just stand there waiting instead. You pretty much know the circumstances of death from an individual scene, so you're not having to formulate links and synthesize new knowledge. This is why I think so many people have an issue with this chapter, not because of its narrative content. If anything, it's more interesting than many of the mainline chapters. Instead, it's because it breaks the structural and progression gating rules upon which the rest of the game is established. What this does is really bring attention to what does work and how powerful the nonlinear structure with knowledge-gated progression is in Return of the Obra Dinn. As soon as that stuff is gone, the game loses a lot of its charm. There is one last thing which sells the experience. The game could have perfect pacing, a perfect narrative structure, and a satisfying logic progression system, But that doesn't mean you'll want to keep playing the game. You have to be invested in the moment-to-moment presence. That's why Lucas Pope, by his own admission, prioritized holding the mood for the player as much as possible. That's the last element in what makes Return of the Obra Dinn work, by emphasizing its immersive qualities. In the medium of written literature, much of the physicality of settings and characters are offloaded to the reader's imagination. Of course, the writer has to create the right conditions for this to occur, but this is exactly why a lot of people who read the books first will complain about the stylistic choices made in movie adaptations. Return of the Obra Dinn manages to capture this sense of the mind doing so much fill in the blanks throughout the game. This is in large part due to the 1-bit art style. It cements a wonderfully unique identity to the game which makes it instantly recognizable. But more importantly, it allows the game to play out as if every frame were an intentionally designed piece of 1-bit artwork. Not quite every frame a painting, more like every frame a pixel art PNG. But it's the simplicity of the low resolution and the binary color presentation that means your mind is forced to fill in a lot of the gaps. Playing the game kind of feels like a halfway point between reading a setting in a book and seeing a setting realized on film or in a photorealistic render. Because your mind is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, you're focused on the ship, the story, and the characters within it with a lot more intent than if the details had been clearer. Before each scene in the game, where you experience someone's death, the screen is blank, except for captions of the words spoken by the people in the scene. This means the mind ignites with imagination as the soundscape tells its own story. Then, the scene arrives, and of course, it's static. No animations. A picture might tell 1,000 words, but they tell 1,000 different permutations of 1,000 words, and no two interpretations of events in Return of the Obra Dinn's death scenes will ever be perfectly identical. It's a balanced dichotomy of explicit visual and auditory presentation with enough missing information to execute the book-like quality of the experience. Of course, the sound design can't be ignored. The creaking of the ship as it bobs in the water when you're below deck. It grounds the player in such a strong sense of presence. Then there's the soundtrack. It sounds like someone was told, "This organ is on fire, you have 3 minutes to play its final piece, go." It gives a sense of grandeur to the wider narrative and world. I'm astounded that a generalist like Lucas Pope has such refined skills across his disciplines, that everything from the gameplay to the art design to even the soundtrack, which he did himself, are all of such high quality. It clearly helps in executing such a focused creative vision like that in Return of the Obra Dinn. At the same time, everything in and on the ship is believable, and this is in no small part to the immense research Lucas Pope did to have accurate attention to detail. The ship design, the crew structure, the geography of the ship's voyage. When you go back to check after the fact, it's all impressively accurate. The only exception here is perhaps the number of people on the ship. Pope's mentioned that he had to cut the more realistic larger number down to 60 so he could actually finish making the game. In the end, it's the combination of all these immersive elements which sell the game in the first place and make traversing the ship and its moments of disaster intrinsically engaging. So, if Return of the Obra Dinn does such a good job executing the premise of progression bound strictly by knowledge and understanding over mechanical input, why haven't we seen this become more common? Well, there are some exceptions. The Outer Wilds, while not invoking a detective roleplay, is a much wider take on the concept, and it pulls its own tricks to get its detailed world to be engaging to explore. Also recently, The Case of the Golden Idol released, describing itself as a new kind of detective game that allows you to think and investigate freely. This is another similar approach as seen in Obra Dinn. However, these two games are the only robust examples I can come up with. This premise is not at all common in the industry at large. While it's a shame, the one and done nature of these games means there's no replay value, and this can turn some players off. From a publisher's perspective, who wants a game that no one's going to revisit? Then playtesting becomes hard too, when a playtester, much like a paper straw, is only good for one use. Ultimately, this is something only destined for the indie space, where there's some tolerance to risk. Return of the Obra Dinn synergizes a series of gameplay, narrative, and logical elements to make an experience more engaging than it has any right to be. It's a result of laser-focused creative design, and has brought a genuinely novel concept into the domain of gaming, a feat which can be attributed to few other games. I find myself disappointed, in a sense, that Obra Dinn has not turned out to offer its premise as something which can be applied at scale, as interesting as it is. However, perhaps this is what makes the game so memorable in the first place. There's almost nothing else like it in design, and it makes reflecting on the unique experience the game provides that much more special.